Morning in the town arrived like a slow breath, a mist curling over rooftops and the river laying down its thin silver ribbon between the fields. She woke to it the way a flower turns to light, without hurry, without noise, listening to the clatter of a cyclist on the lane and the soft hum of her mother in the kitchen. The house was old enough to complain when the wind moved across it, but inside it held a steady warmth, the kind that lingers in places where people have loved one another with ordinary devotion for a long time. She lay in bed for a while, watching dust spin in the window's pale square, and let the morning press its cool hand against her forehead. There was a day to step into, and a life that fit like a familiar coat, and yet, just outside the edges of that comfort, something waited, something she had not yet named. The town itself was small enough that one could know it by smell: the bread at 7, the soap from the laundry at 8, the metallic hint of the train at 9. She walked its streets like a reader returning to her favourite chapter, almost able to speak the lines before they arrived. The bookshop owner with the tilted glasses would nod when she passed, lifting a hand as if to turn a page. The florist always dusted the petals of his peonies as though they were notes on a violin. The postman whistled the same thin tune every Tuesday, but never the rest of the week. On market days, the square carried the colour of piled fruit, and the church bells braided air and time into something soft and dependable. This was the world she knew, and it knew her back. It spoke her name in small ways. Her name was Eliza, and she had learned to be a quiet sort of beautiful, the kind people notice after they've already told you their stories. She worked at the library on the hill, a building with skin of brick and a spine of oak beams, and she loved it with the tenderness some reserve for living things. Each key turned the lock like a morning prayer. She found comfort in the ritual of untying strings from parcels of new arrivals, sliding the jacket covers on, stamping the dates that gave books their temporary permissions to leave and return. The smell of paper and dust and linen glue could undo the knots worry made in her. An hour shelving in the 19th century novels could rebuild her piece by piece. At the far end of the upstairs hall, in an alcove where the windows caught western light, stood a little table with 2 chairs. It looked out across the town: chimney pots, laundry lines, the shy curve of the river. On her lunch breaks, she took her tea there and kept company with words that had crossed oceans to reach her. Jane's practical wit, George's grave musings, the new poets with their honesty like raw silk. She read the way some pray, and when she closed a book, she felt kissed on the brow by something both fierce and gentle. Perhaps that was why she held so tightly to a hope she rarely named aloud, that one day life would greet her with the same intimacy, the same sense of being chosen and seen. Her mother, Ruth, kept a small garden and a tidy conscience. She possessed a store of rough-spun wisdom for any hour or ache, and her hands could do a dozen things without forgetting tenderness. "It's not wrong to want a life that shines," she would say, "but you must still be able to find yourself by touch when the lights go out." Eliza listened, smiling, half absorbing the lesson the way the lawn drinks the evening dew. She loved her mother's calmness, the way it filled the kitchen like a second warmth. On Sundays they baked bread together and sent loaves, still breathing steam, to the neighbour who lived alone. The rituals stitched their days into something with shape, and yet the thread of longing ran through it, bright and fine and unbroken. She did not tell many people about the dreams that visited her before sleep gathered her up. They weren't dramatic, no rescues in them, no capes. Instead, they were doorways, a station platform where a stranger's suitcase bore the same initials as hers, a theatre balcony where a hand reached for the shared armrest and hesitated in a choreography of shyness, a city street at dusk, and the feel of warm rain recognizing her wrists. In the dreams, there was a conversation both delicate and inexhaustible, the sort that unspools and loops back and makes new maps of two familiar lives. She would wake with the taste of that future still in her mouth, sweet and strange, and the ordinary room would feel like a preface to a story she wanted to read very slowly. On weekday evenings she walked home the long way, choosing the path along the river even when the sky had already taken on its dim blue sweater. There was a bridge with ironwork lace, and she stopped at its middle to watch the water collect light from the houses and carry it downstream in ribbons. She thought often of time as a kind of river, too, how it gathered moments, carried them forward, braided them with other currents. Sometimes she would lift her hand and imagine, not dramatically but earnestly, that a palm could catch an hour and make of it a gift. She told herself she wouldn't spend her days waiting. She would live them with both hands. And yet, even as she vowed this, the quiet door of expectation kept swinging open. The town had a few myths of its own. Old men on the benches under the plane trees liked to say that every decade or so a pair of strangers would arrive on the same day and leave 10 years later with matching smiles. The florist smiled when he told the tale, as if he had tied the ribbon on that departure himself. Eliza didn't mock it. Small towns require their stories the way ships require ballast. She just held the myth lightly, the way one holds a bright coin not yet spent, knowing that hope has its own economy. At the library, she moved through seasons of readers. In spring, the students arrived with arms full of anxious paper, and she showed them where history kept its cooler voice. In summer, the travellers came, smelling of airports and novelty, asking for maps and local novels as if words and roads led to the same door. Autumn belonged to the serious ones, the people who had decided to learn a language or a craft before the year turned, and the mirror insisted on honesty. Winter brought the lonely, who asked for ghost stories and left with cookbooks. Eliza watched these small migrations with a kindness that didn't need to name itself. It pleased her to be a place where strangers could find the exact sentences they needed to remember or forget. For herself, she tried to be deliberate without becoming rigid. She saved money in a heavy glass jar on the mantel, coins like wishes, folded bills like promises. She imagined a future space that smelled like cedar, with windows that made the sky feel close, and a table that understood evening light. She saw herself placing a bowl on that table, and the same pair of hands always reaching to help, a small laugh shared without effort. The image returned to her in different forms. A cafe in a city she had not yet met, a cabin with snow making the silence around it honest, a narrow apartment where walls learned the names of books. The particulars changed, but the element that mattered was constant, a companionable tenderness that neither demanded performance nor feared depth. There were suitors. A town does not leave a woman entirely to her imaginings. The baker's son with the easy smile and the sooty elbows, the schoolteacher visiting from a nearby village who talked with reverence about geography, a man from the council whose hair always looked as if it had recently been convinced to behave. They were all kind in their ways, and she treated them with the simple respect that keeps doorways open, but she felt in each conversation a gentle edge of misfit, as if the language between them had been learned phonetically rather than lived. Her mother recognized the look that entered Eliza's eyes after such encounters, a grace of gratitude without consent, and said nothing. There are silences, Ruth believed, that are more faithful than advice. On certain nights, when the moon let the apples shine and the churring insects assigned small tasks to the dark, Eliza would sit on the back steps with a blanket and a book and listen to the town finish its sentences. The neighbour's radio kept itself at a volume that showed consideration. A couple argued in murmurs about whether a ladder could be safely leaned against a maple. A cat allowed itself to be convinced to come inside. She loved these noises with a loyalty she could not fully explain. They reminded her that love, when it arrived, would not have to shout to be recognized. It would feel like these domestic sounds do, not grand, not ostentatious, but indisputable. She wrote letters she didn't send, not many, only 3 or 4 each year, always in autumn, always on paper that absorbed ink as if it had been waiting just for her words. She would begin, "Dear, you," because the addressee had not yet declared himself into a proper noun. Then she would tell him about the first day the leaves turned copper on the big sycamore near the square, and the elderly couple who held hands anyway as they crossed, and the way a child in a red coat stomped in a puddle and laughed as if the world had finally explained itself. She told him about a line from a novel that made her put the book down and look out the window, needing the sky to hold the meaning while she folded it. She told him she hoped he was already building a life that fit him softly, and that when they met, neither would be asked to shrink into the other's corners. She signed only E, folded the paper, and placed it in a box in the bottom drawer of her dresser. The box was not a promise to be foolish. It was a place where hope could practice speaking without embarrassment. Her favourite hour of the week was Saturday at 10 in the morning, when children arrived at the library for stories. She read to them as if sound had textures, the velvet of L, the blue crackle of K, the round comfort of O. Their small bodies leaned forward at the same places in each tale, and their eyes widened like instructions. Sometimes a parent, mid-exhaustion, looked up from a phone and let relief replace worry. In those moments, the room seemed to understand itself. "This is what we are for," it said, "to bring the incredibly human into one another's reach." When the hour ended and little hands placed books carefully on tables, Eliza felt that intricate gratitude that makes a day's ordinary labours feel like devotion. There was, too, a lake outside town, really a widened part of the river where the banks spread their arms and gave the water room to slow and become reflective. On summer evenings, she went there with her mother to watch swallows do the work of pattern across the air. They talked of practical things, the roof that would need attention before winter, the price of tomatoes, whether the sermon had asked the right questions, if it is even a sermon's business to ask or answer. Sometimes they were silent, sharing the easy courage that grows when 2 people have borne each other's small disappointments without keeping score. Here, more than anywhere, Eliza felt the fine wire of her longing hum. The lake held the sky twice, above and below, and she thought, with a tenderness bordering on ache, that one day she and someone else would sit here balancing each other's thoughts like stones. She did not believe in destiny as an errand boy who comes when called. She believed in rooms prepared for honest company, in work done well, in the patient excellence of listening. She believed in hands that learn another's pulse and treat it with a kind of scholarship. Still, there were days when the thought of remaining unchosen arrived with a little shadow attached. On those days, she gave herself the grace of a small purchase, a pear from the market chosen for the faint fragrance at the stem, a ribbon in a colour that reminded her that names are not the only way to be recognized, a candle that smelled faintly of pine and paper, as if the forest and the library had agreed to share breath. These were not cures, and she did not require cures. They were gestures, a way of saying to the part of herself that watched life through a slightly fogged window pane, "I see you. I am with you. I will not let you become a rumor in your own life." At night, when the house settled and the clock in the hall made its reasonable announcements of passing quarter hours, she lay awake and watched the ceiling discover and rediscover darkness. If a car went by, its headlights created a brief architecture on the plaster, a travelling cathedral, a migrating window. She thought about the threshold between wish and plan, and how to stand there without becoming either a pilgrim who never arrives or a clerk who never dreams. In that threshold she placed simple intentions. Tomorrow I will ask Mrs. Ellery about her grandson's exam. Tomorrow I will learn the name of the boy who reads at the end of the aisle and always pretends he's not reading. Tomorrow I will try a new recipe and not apologize if it is not perfect. Tomorrow I will not measure myself only against my future. And yet, even as she disciplined herself toward presence, the future sometimes grazed her with a friendliness she couldn't refuse. In the bakery queue, her mind would stage a scene with hilarious detail, the person before her unsure whether to choose the almond croissant or the apricot tart, and her offering a delighted defense of both, and the small laughter they would share at the seriousness of pastry. In the park, a bench looked suddenly like a pause made for two, and she imagined a voice she had not yet heard saying, "Sit. Tell me the best sentence you read today." She didn't chide herself for these flourishes. She understood that a heart is a musician. It must practice whether or not the stage is promised. Once, during a storm that the town would later refer to only as the one with the good thunder, the power went out just after dinner. Candles found their reason. The dark condensed into a single conversation with rain. Eliza and her mother played cards at the kitchen table and told each other stories from the years before memory became a tidy ledger. Ruth spoke of the way Eliza's father had laughed, the sort of laugh that makes at least one other person in the room stand up without knowing why, and of the morning he had taped poems to the fridge as if they were grocery lists. He had been gone a long time, and grief had learned to sit down without claiming the whole chair. Eliza listened and understood again that love leaves signatures that do not fade. When the power returned, the room looked oddly smaller, as if the candles had revealed not what was missing, but how much had been present all along. She slept late the next morning, unbothered by a rare indulgence. In her dream, just before waking, she had been walking through a station whose ceiling arched like a cathedral, and the trains announced their intentions with a gentleness she wished schedules always showed. She carried a book she had loved at 13 and loved differently now, and as she turned a corner she saw a suitcase with her initials, not arranged deliberately, not a trick of label or coincidence, but truly hers. She reached for it, and the dream did what dreams do, brought waking like a curtain down. She lay there in the bright square of the window, feeling both robbed and given to, and decided not to scold the day for arriving. She dressed in a cream sweater and a skirt that understood movement, tied her hair back with the blue ribbon, and went to find whatever words and errands this morning had assigned her. On her way down the hill to the library, the sky was a clear, rinsed thing, and the river moved with the assurance of a sentence that knows its verb. She greeted the bookshop owner and the florist and waved to the postman, who paused his Tuesday tune to tip his cap. She felt, not for the first time, a soft alignment, as if the world and she were lightly holding hands. Perhaps this is what readiness feels like, she thought, not hunger in its sharp clothes, not impatience in its bright shoes, but something quieter, room made inside oneself without checking the door every 5 minutes. She unlocked the library. The smell of paper stepped forward like an old friend. On the desk lay the parcels she had been expecting, wrapped in brown paper and string. She set to work with the pleasure of someone doing exactly what she is good at in a place where that goodness is welcomed. She opened, catalogued, stamped and shelved, and when the clock reached the hour she loved most, she poured tea and carried it to the alcove. The town discovered itself again in the window. Lines of laundry, like flags of undemanding countries, the pale suggestion of the far fields, the speech of leaves. She opened her book and read a page that made her think the writer had briefly been in the alcove yesterday, watching with her eyes. She closed it and looked out at the river, which went on being faithful to its task of moving while reflecting. And there, in that ordinary and hallowed moment, holding warm tea and a sentence that would matter to her for years, she felt the smallest change in the air, as if the page were about to turn itself, as if the room had quietly pulled another chair up to the table. She did not name it. She did not chase it. She let it be a kindness without a label, a beginning that knew better than to announce itself. She lifted her cup, took a slow sip, and allowed herself a private thought that did not diminish the day, but gathered it. Somewhere, perhaps already on his way to this town, or simply waking under a different window, was a person who would one day recognize her as one recognizes one's own handwriting. She smiled then, not the smile she gave polite conversations, or even the one that visited when a paragraph behaved itself exactly, but a rarer one that arrived from far inside, where hope rubs its eyes and looks around and says, "Yes, I am still here." The room seemed to accept the smile, the way good rooms do, and outside the window the river kept moving, and the town did what towns do, believed in its people a little without telling them, and held its breath for the lovely ordinary miracles it had seen often enough to trust. The day her life tilted began as gently as all the others, with the river folding silver into itself and the town yawning awake beneath a sky rinsed clear of clouds. Eliza did not yet know that the hours ahead would carry the first tremor of change, that the familiar rhythm of bells and bread carts would suddenly be pierced by a sound entirely new, the hum of a car engine not often heard in their quiet lanes. She was shelving books in the poetry section, her fingers brushing across spines like a pianist who cannot resist the keys, when she noticed a shadow pass the glass of the library's front door. It was not the postman, not one of the children she recognized, not the widow who came for cookbooks on Mondays. This figure was taller, straighter, wrapped in a confidence that seemed to arrive in the room a step before he did. The door opened with a hush of wood, and there he was, a stranger, but not easily dismissed as one. His coat was dark, tailored with a precision that belonged to the city, and his shoes spoke in polished syllables against the floor. He carried himself as if the world had never refused him, and yet his gaze, when it settled on her, held a warmth that suggested he noticed details others overlooked. He smiled, not broadly, but with the quiet surety of a man who knows a smile can be more disarming than a sword. Eliza, startled into stillness, felt her heart betray her with a sudden, inexplicable quickening. He asked about a book, something rare, a volume of essays she had only recently placed in the glass cabinet reserved for the less-fingered treasures. His voice was low, threaded with the cadence of someone accustomed to being listened to. She fetched the key, her hands steady though her pulse was not, and when she placed the book into his waiting hands, their fingers brushed. It was a touch so brief it could have been accident, but in that blink of skin against skin she felt a spark that leapt through the ordinary air of the library and lit a hidden lantern inside her. She withdrew her hand quickly, embarrassed, but he did not seem to notice. Or perhaps he noticed too much and chose silence as his courtesy. When he gave his name, Adrian, it rolled into the room with a resonance that suggested stories already attached to it. Names sometimes carry entire histories, and his seemed weighted with victories. He lingered a little, asking questions not only about books, but about her. Did she enjoy working here? What had drawn her to words? Where did she take her tea? Each question was offered without insistence, but with an attentiveness that made her feel as if her answers were gems placed in his palm. She found herself speaking more than she usually did with strangers, and in that hour the alcove table seemed to have grown another chair without her noticing. Whis! When he left, the library seemed oddly larger, as though he had bent the light and space around him and taken it with him. She stood for a while at the door, watching his figure retreat to a car unlike any she had seen in Bede Curva. Sleek, black, the sort of vehicle that announces not arrival but possession. The engine purred like a kept promise, and she realized her hands were still tingling from where his fingers had grazed hers. The books around her, the town beyond her window, all appeared momentarily insufficient to the rush blooming inside her. She had always known her life was waiting for something. Today it had knocked on the library door. In the days that followed, Adrian appeared again and again, as if the town had become his chosen retreat. He came with orchids once, white and fragile as breath, their fragrance spilling across the counter where she stamped dates. He spoke to her mother with the courtesy of a man who understood the value of maternal blessing. He opened doors with the ease of someone raised on the rituals of chivalry, and every small gesture seemed rehearsed not from habit, but from devotion. To walk beside him was to be ushered into a world just a few shades brighter than the one she had known. Streets seemed shorter, evenings longer, the stars more deliberate in their shine. For Eliza, the transformation was dizzying. The quiet heart that had written unsent letters now pulsed with possibility. She found herself laughing in ways that felt unfamiliar but welcome, her steps lighter, her hours threaded with anticipation. When Adrian drove her along the river in his car, its windows opening to the smell of pine and dusk, she felt for the first time that her dreams were no longer confined to paper and imagination. They were unfolding, tangible, dressed in the scent of leather seats and the low murmur of a man speaking to her as if she were the only listener he required. The town noticed, of course. In small places, love arrives like weather, impossible not to remark upon. Whispers followed them down the cobbled lanes, but she was too wrapped in the velvet cocoon of wonder to care. She had wanted a life that shone, and suddenly, under Adrian's gaze, she glittered. And so it was that her ordinary world, once bound by bookshelves and river walks, began to tilt toward a horizon she had only ever glimpsed in dreams. She was stepping, slowly but surely, into the second act of her story, and though she did not yet know the full shape of it, she felt its promise humming beneath her skin. The river still moved as it always had, The bells still tolled, but Eliza's heart had quickened into a new rhythm, the rhythm of a story that had found its first true turning. The town had always carried its silences like folded handkerchiefs in pockets, neat, soft, almost invisible. But in the weeks after Adrian began to appear at Eliza's side, the silences took on a new weight. They lingered in her mother's eyes, in the slight hesitation of the baker as he handed over a loaf, in the lowered voices of women at the market. It was not unkindness, not exactly. It was the hush of people who suspect that something is not entirely as it seems. Eliza, however, was too entangled in her own awakening to notice the shift. To her, the world seemed to breathe more quickly, as if the rhythm of her pulse had infected the very air. Adrian's presence was not occasional. It was constant, deliberate. He wove himself into her days with the precision of a man accustomed to conquest. Mornings he would appear with coffee already sweetened the way she preferred, pressing the cup into her hand with an intimacy that made her blush. Afternoons he met her at the library steps, whisking her into the city for dinners in restaurants where the tablecloths were heavier than anything she owned and the chandeliers scattered light like melted stars. Evenings belonged to long drives, the car humming across countryside roads where he spoke of business ventures, of ambitions, of cities far larger than hers, and of the way he believed she belonged in them by his side. At first she was dazzled. Who wouldn't be? Orchids instead of roses, jewels nestled in velvet boxes instead of trinkets. The brush of his hand against hers as he guided her into cars, rooms, whole new worlds. He had a way of looking at her as though she were both the question and the answer, as though her very existence confirmed something in him. She bloomed beneath that gaze, intoxicated by the reflection of herself she saw in his eyes. For the first time, she felt as though the stories she had read late at night, the heroines lifted out of obscurity by love that glimmered with wealth and wonder, were no longer just ink on paper. They were her life. But the cracks began almost imperceptibly, like hairline fractures in porcelain that only reveal themselves under the right light. The first came in the form of his friends. They were men of similar bearing, sharp suits, polished manners, eyes that watched more than they spoke. Adrian called them his brothers, though not by blood. He insisted their presence was essential. They advised him, guided him, had stood beside him when his company was nothing but an idea scribbled on a napkin. They entered Eliza's world like shadows, always polite, always near, always just close enough for her to feel observed. At dinners, one of them was always present. At the theatre, she caught sight of another in the lobby, pretending not to notice her, though his gaze clung to her profile. At the market, she once turned to find one standing at the end of an aisle, selecting oranges with exaggerated care, though his eyes never left her. Adrian brushed off her unease with a gentle laugh. "They care for me, for us," he would say, stroking her hand. "You'll come to see they are only here to protect what matters." And because she wanted to believe him, because she had learned to see him as the man who had lifted her into brightness, she swallowed her doubt and smiled. The second crack came in the form of gifts that unsettled more than delighted. At first, it had been orchids, handbags, silken scarves in shades that made her skin glow. But soon the gifts took on a sharper edge. A pair of high heels so tall she wobbled in them, though he insisted they made her legs divine. A corset that pressed her waist so tightly she felt breathless, though he whispered that it turned her into art. A slender leather belt, gifted with a smile that seemed too knowing, too rehearsed. "Wear it for me," he murmured, and though the request was soft, it held the weight of command. She obeyed, telling herself it was playful, intimate, but in the mirror, the reflection felt less like herself and more like a character in someone else's script. The third crack was silence, the silence of his absences at odd hours. He would disappear suddenly, leaving her in glittering rooms with only his friends for company. They filled the air with stories of his brilliance, of his sacrifices, of the empire he was building. Their words dripped admiration, but their eyes spoke another language entirely, one she could not translate. When she asked where Adrian had gone, they always said the same. Business. That single word, polished and vague, left her feeling both foolish and trapped. Yet when Adrian returned, smiling, apologizing, draping her in yet another gift, she let the questions dissolve against his lips. Love, she reminded herself, required trust. Still, unease crept into her dreams. She began to imagine doors that would not open, rooms where shadows whispered her name, mirrors that showed her bound in silk and unable to speak. She woke from these dreams breathless, clutching the sheets as though they were her last defense. By morning, Adrian's hand on her waist and his laughter in her ear seemed to banish the visions, and so she convinced herself that doubt was merely the price of great love, that every fairy tale demanded its thorn. Her mother noticed, of course. Ruth had lived long enough to recognize the subtle dimming of her daughter's eyes, the way joy had grown more performative, as though Eliza were acting happiness rather than inhabiting it. "He is handsome," Ruth said one evening as they kneaded dough together, "and generous." She paused, pressing her fist into the pliant bread. "But generosity can be another word for control. Do you feel free, Eliza?" The question landed like a stone in her chest. She laughed, brushing it away, unwilling to admit the truth even to herself. "Of course, Mamma. I have everything I ever dreamed of." But later that night, lying beside orchids whose fragrance had soured in the dark, she wondered if dreams could sometimes become cages lined with velvet. The days hurried toward their engagement. Adrian proposed in a flurry of candles and champagne, his friends appearing as witnesses before she had even said yes. Their clapping echoed too loudly in the small room, but she silenced her hesitation by looking at the ring, a diamond that caught the light and fractured it into 1,000 dazzling lies. She nodded, whispered yes, and felt the world tilt once more. The town rejoiced. Her mother cried. The library patrons congratulated her, though some voices carried a thin veil of concern. She told herself it was envy. It was easier than listening to the gnawing doubt in her own chest. As preparations for the wedding began, the cracks widened. Adrian's friends were everywhere, choosing the chandelier, approving the menu, even selecting the music. When she tried to assert her preferences, Adrian smiled and said, "Trust me, love. They know what's best." Each decision stolen from her felt like a page torn from the book of her life, and yet, when Adrian looked at her with that same intense devotion, she felt guilty for doubting. Could such a gaze hide malice? Could such tenderness be anything but love? One evening, as they sat in the car overlooking the river, he slipped a bracelet around her wrist. It was black leather, tighter than she liked. "A token," he said, fastening it despite her protest, "to remind you that you're mine, always." She forced a smile, but inside her pulse raced with unease. Mine. The word echoed long after the night ended, long after the car's engine fell silent. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the bracelet pressing against her skin like a question she could not answer. The town's silences grew heavier. Her mother prayed longer. Eliza wrote no more letters to her imagined beloved. She tore the old ones into pieces and scattered them into the river, as though to bury the part of herself that still believed in gentler love. She told herself she had chosen, that this was destiny, that happiness required surrender. And yet, every time Adrian's friends appeared at her door, their gazes lingering too long, their smiles too measured, she felt the chill of a storm gathering just beyond the horizon. By the time the wedding was only weeks away, the cracks were no longer invisible. They were fissures, deep and undeniable. And though she wrapped herself in silk and promises, though she smiled for the town and laughed for Adrian, deep inside she knew the truth. The dream she had so desperately longed for was shifting beneath her feet, and the story she was living might not be the fairy tale she had once believed. It might instead be the prelude to something darker. The morning chose a dress of clear light. The river pressed its thin palm to the town, and the bells, those faithful keepers of other people's promises, began their hourly work. Eliza woke inside the hush that comes on days when something irreversible has already set its weight upon the air. The gown hung on the wardrobe door like a secret she had agreed to keep. Silk spilled to the floor in a quiet tide. The veil waited, gauze, pearled, a cloud willing to be owned. Her mother moved about the room with the practiced tenderness of a nurse and the hush of a priest, pinning, smoothing, kissing the top of Eliza's head as if she could bless the very thoughts out of it. "Breathe," Ruth said. "Not for them, for you." "I'm trying," Eliza answered, and heard how far away her own voice lived. She was a beautiful shape in the mirror. Every seam told that story. But somewhere behind the light on her skin, a small door kept knocking. She could not decide whether to answer it or to pretend the knocking was wind. The bracelet Adrian had given her lay on the vanity, a dark loop of leather with a polished clasp. She thought of leaving it there. She thought of how easily a refusal could burst a day like a glass. She lifted it, tried it on, felt the snugness bite the soft underside of her wrist, and told herself she was merely decorating consent. Adrian called once, his voice carrying its usual lacquer of charm, a note of haste underneath. "I've arranged a surprise," he said. "The lads will fetch you before the ceremony. Something small. You'll love it." The word lads brushed against her like cold silk. She pressed a smile into the phone that she hoped he could hear. "All right," she said. And then the line emptied, and she was left with the steady animal of her pulse. They came at noon, precisely. Black suits, good shoes, the performance of cheer. The car's back door opened and shaped itself to receive her. Ruth stood on the steps and watched her go, the way one watches a ship leave a harbour it might not return to. And Eliza saw, for a splinter of a second, a plea in her mother's eyes, a rope thrown silently across a distance neither of them had chosen. Then the door closed. The town slid past. The river unstitched itself from view. The building in the city was one she'd seen once before, a modern jewel box of glass and clean lines, high enough that the sky knocked on its windows. "He's waiting upstairs," Andre said, softly, as if a soft voice could make the words harmless. The elevator rose with its civilized hush. Her veil lifted in the current of motion. Her hands found each other and tried to be brave. The apartment door was ajar. That detail, small as a fingernail, placed itself in the center of her attention. Inside, a view that behaved like a spell. A table set with pale flowers and a cake in the shape of a promise. The same orchids that had for weeks explained what beauty was supposed to mean. "Adrian?" she called, her voice careful not to echo. There was no answer, only the low, expensive sound of a fridge thinking to itself and the faraway complaint of a plane unzipping the afternoon. "We'll tell him you're here," Igor said. His smile was all polished surface. She could see herself, small and curved inside it. The men did not leave. They stepped farther in, arranging themselves as if they had been given a blocking chart and time to rehearse. Pavle lifted the lid on a silver bucket and eased a bottle from its ice, like a magician revealing a dove. "For the bride," he said, and poured. The champagne pin-pricked the surface of the flute and climbed it like a ladder. "I'll wait for him," Eliza said. She held the glass but didn't drink. The leather on her wrist felt tighter, as if the skin underneath had swollen with a decision. "You're safe," Andre murmured, and the word safe did the opposite of what it was supposed to do. It made the room tilt. Silences moved in. Those same silences the town had been folding and slipping away. And Eliza saw, with new exactness, the way the men looked at her, not leering, not even hungry, appraising. A buyer's gaze at an object already paid for. Her heart executed a small, private rebellion. The knock behind the door inside her turned into a fist. "Where is he?" she asked, and heard the steadiness in her voice, like a plank laid across water. "Delayed," Igor said. "He asked us to begin. He said you'd understand." Begin. The verb landed like a slap. She set the glass down carefully so that no drop would escape to stain the white tablecloth, and stepped back. "No," she said, and the word was both a whisper and a bell. "Tell him I'm leaving." The three men exchanged a glance. Not surprise, calculation, a quick recalibration of a script. Andre lifted his hands, palms visible, the performance of gentleness. "Eliza, he loves you. Today is about welcoming you properly. You belong with us, with him. This is what he wants, what he planned for you." The last sentence placed the entire shape of her future into a past tense she had not agreed to. Fear rose, the clean, cold kind that clarifies, but so did something older and more muscular, her sense of herself, the stubborn bone of it. She thought of Ruth's question over the bread, "Do you feel free?" The truth arrived in her like air in a drowning body. "Unlock the door," she said. "Let's not be dramatic," Pavle murmured, which is the sentence used by men who have already prepared a stage for you. "Unlock the door," she said again, and moved, not the way prey moves, not with the jerky movements of panic, but with the directness of a person who has decided that the story will not be written without her hand in the ink. She crossed the room, fingers grazing the back of a chair as if testing gravity, and reached for the handle. It was locked, a soft, impeccable lock that had been planned the way the table was planned. Her vision narrowed, then steadied itself. She lifted her chin. "Give me the key." Igor smiled, pitying. "He has it. And where is he?" "On his way." A pause. A tiny universe opened inside it, glittering with outcomes. She could scream. The windows would only let sound fall back into the room. She could plead. The words would make her small. She could run. There was nowhere to run to that wasn't part of a plan with her name on it. Or she could look for the seam. Every trap has one. A lazy knot, a habit, a human thing forgotten. She turned, slowly, taking in the room as if it were a page she had been asked to read aloud. The table, the kitchen island, the hallway leading to what must be a bedroom. The elevator would require a key card. The balcony, there, a rib of black iron running along glass. City air pressed a hand to the sliding door. If she could get to that small border between inside and sky... "Eliza," Andre said, sharper now. He had moved a step closer. She smiled, the smile she used with patrons who had come to return a book 3 months late, the smile that said, "I understand. I am not your enemy. I will do what is wise." She lifted the champagne, finally drank. The glitter of bubbles gave her a brief shelter. "Where are your glasses?" she asked. "Let me pour for all of us. It would be rude to drink alone." It was Pavle who took the bait, turning toward the kitchen to fetch stems. In that shift there was a new angle to the room, a corridor of space between Andre's patience and Igor's performance. Eliza moved the way a thought moves, swiftly, without asking permission. She stepped to the balcony door, slid it hard. The sound made the men start. Cold air surged in, honest and bracing. She gathered her skirt and stepped out into it. The balcony was narrow and sky-high. The city tilted its chin upward to watch. The iron rail bit the base of her palms as she gripped it. For a heartbeat, vertigo flirted with her, and then, mercifully, withdrew, leaving only clarity behind. On the adjoining balcony, a planter box, rosemary, thyme, a residency of bees. A small table with 2 chairs and a folded newspaper like a sleeping bird. A separator panel between the balconies, translucent, a little flexible. She pressed and felt it give. "Eliza." Andre again at the threshold. He was trying to put softness back into his mouth. "Come inside." "No," she said, and the word grew muscles she did not know it possessed. She shoved the panel. It bowed and then popped from its bracket with a crack that shot through the air like a starter pistol. She squeezed through, silk hissing. The veil caught and tore with a sound like paper giving up. On the other balcony, the sliding door was cracked for a cat that had already slipped inside. She dragged it wider and entered a room that felt immediately different. Lived in. A sweater on a chair, a mug with a ring of tea, a framed child's drawing of a house, and a sun insisting on its right to be large. "Hello," she called, breath tight as a fist. "I'm sorry. I know this is strange. I need to leave. There are men—" She didn't finish, because a woman rounded the corner from the kitchen, dishcloth in hand, eyes widening as fast as doors. "Are you hurt?" the woman asked, instantly rearranging her face into competence. "No, not yet." "Please, your front door." Of course. No questions that might slow salvation, no curiosity used as leash, just action. The woman guided her through a hallway that smelled faintly of lemon and sleep, to an entry where a pram parked like an obedient pony. She took down a set of keys from a bowl and placed them into motion. The lock clicked its "that's that," and the corridor outside the apartment offered itself like a shore. "Take this," the woman said, pressing a cardigan into Eliza's hands. "You're shaking." She looked beyond Eliza's shoulder and saw movement on the balcony they had left. "Go." "Thank you," Eliza said, and the words, old and humble, felt like the truest thing in the room. She stepped into the corridor, closed the door behind her, heard the chain slide home, and ran. The elevator answered quickly, oblivious as machines are to the dramas they ferry. On the ground floor, a concierge looked up, took in the bride, dishevelled, breathless, veil wounded, and began to stand. Eliza shook her head once, an entire sentence compressed into a single movement, and pushed through the revolving door. The city hit her, traffic, light, heat, the grammar of hurry, and she let it fold her in. She didn't look back. She did look for a taxi and found none. She looked for a bus and found one just closing its doors. She caught the driver's eye with her whole face. He opened the doors with a sigh that sounded like a blessing. People stared because people stare. A child smiled because children are kind, before they are taught to be interesting. Eliza clutched the pole, steadied her breath, and allowed the city to carry her like a stream. Her phone had found its way to her palm, as if homed by instinct. She called her mother. The first ring aged her a year, the second taught her everything about prayer she had not yet learned, the third landed, and Ruth answered. "Mama," she said, and the way the word shattered told the rest. "Where are you?" "In the city. Mama, I left." "Good." That single syllable, firm, fierce, reached across the wires and wrapped a coat around her. "Tell me where." Eliza looked up. An advertisement for a furniture store insisted on comfort. A street sign told the truth. She gave coordinates to the only person she trusted to make a map without lying. "Come home," Ruth said. "Come now." And then, with the tender ferocity she had learned from surviving grief, "I am already on my way to meet you." They met the bus 2 stops later. Ruth's small car was a miracle of bad timing and perfect love, nudging into a space where there wasn't one and making it anyway. Eliza got in, the door shut, and for a moment they simply held hands across the handbrake. The gown filled the car with its pale weather. Outside, people continued to do what people do: carry groceries, argue kindly, check their watches, fall in love. "I'm sorry," Eliza said. "No," Ruth answered, and the word's shape was large enough to shelter them both. "You are safe. That is the only sentence we need today." She looked at her daughter with eyes that had learned to see around corners. "He will try to make this your fault. He will come with apologies wrapped like gifts. He will use hunger and shame and the particular politeness taught to women. Listen to me. You are not a sentence he gets to finish." They drove, away from the glass building, away from the script someone had authored for her without permission, back toward the town that knew her name and had watched her practice being brave all her life. On the edge of the city, Eliza felt something leave her body like smoke. She adjusted the cardigan around her shoulders and realized how cold she had been for months. Her phone began to live its other life, vibrating, ringing, announcing. Adrian first, then his friends, then unknown numbers that were not unknown at all. Ruth glanced once at the screen and then back at the road. "We will not pick up a single call until you decide what you want to say," she said. "Until your voice belongs to you again." At home, they did not go to the mirror. They went to the kitchen. Ruth put the kettle on, because some rituals make the bones remember they are not empty. Eliza sat and watched sunlight discover the scratches on the table left by years of knives and elbows. Those marks did not make the wood less beautiful, they made it true. She lay her hands on the plum-brown surface and let it tell her that love was not performance, not a proof. Love was a room where you could set down what you carried and not have it used against you. When the tea arrived, she found her mouth could manage it. Swallowing built a bridge. Ruth said nothing that required answers. She rolled dough for a crust instead, the rise and fold and turn a visible grammar of holding on. Flour made constellations on the counter. The house settled around them with a sound like agreement. Dusk arrived at the hour it had promised. The river outside took on its evening luster. And then, because stories rarely grant reprieve without testing it, a car she recognized slid into the street and stilled. Its engine died with a purr she could feel in her throat. Eliza's breath arranged itself into a square. Ruth's jaw found a new angle. A knock, gentle, performed, a gentlemanly punctuation, visited the door. Neither woman moved. Another knock, a touch firmer, as if the knuckles had been reminded of their job. "Eliza!" Adrian called, and his voice carried too easily through wood. "My love." "Let me explain." "There is nothing to explain," Ruth said quietly. "There is only what is true." He knocked again. "Please." Eliza stood. Not because she wanted his voice nearer, but because she wanted to choose where her spine would be when the next sentence arrived. She moved to the hallway, stopped a foot from the door, and placed her palms against it, feeling the cool of the paint. Through that thin plank of boundary, she could almost detect his warmth, the shape of his handsome untruths. "You frightened me," she said. "You used me." A breath on the other side of the wood. "No, I wanted to share everything with you. I wanted you to belong. I thought you wanted—" "You thought I would agree to whatever you planned," she said, and discovered how clean a voice can be when it is done apologizing. "You mistook my kindness for consent. You mistook my love for surrender." Silence. Then the new script, contrition. He performed it beautifully. She could see the tilt of his head without seeing it, the hand over the heart, the subtle drop of volume that asks a woman to fill it with forgiveness. "I am sorry," he said. "It was clumsy. I should have introduced things more slowly. I believed you would understand. I believed you would love me the way I am." "I could have," she said, and the truth surprised them both. "I could have loved you if you had told me the truth, and then given me the freedom to answer. But you built a room you meant me to live in, and did not ask whether it had windows." Another silence. Behind it, the thrum of a man accustomed to getting back what he dropped. "Come outside," he said. "Let me take you somewhere. We can talk." "No," she said, and the word rang through the house and found purchase in the beams. "You are not taking me anywhere again." His patience thinned. "Eliza, don't be foolish. Think about your reputation." "Think about how this will look," she laughed, one soft, incredulous sound. Reputation, the lace used to tie women into pretty shapes. "I am thinking about my soul," she said. Ruth appeared in the hall, a quiet general, and placed a hand on her daughter's shoulder. The door stood between the women and the man, an old, painted, ordinary thing that had suddenly become sacred. "We are finished," Eliza said. His reply came as a crack, short, ugly, through the facade of apology. "We are not finished," he insisted, and now the metal underneath his velvet showed. "You are my fiancé. Do you understand? You don't leave me." Ruth leaned closer to the door. "She just did," she said, and her voice, which could soothe ovens and sick children and stubborn seasons, became as sharp as winter. "You may go now." Steps on gravel. A hesitation that sounded like a man considering if a performance had any acts left. Then the car's door, the engine, the departure dressed to resemble retreat. Through the window, they watched the taillights thread themselves back toward the road that led to the city and all its glass. Eliza sagged before she realized the body does that. Ruth caught her. They folded into each other the way trees sometimes do, growing together after separate years. In the kitchen, the kettle boiled itself empty and asked to be fed again. Night found them where the day had left them. Hands around warm cups, the door shut, the river repeating its patient grammar. Eliza went to her room and sat on the floor among the lace and the pins and the collapsed veil. She unclasped the bracelet and placed it on the carpet, a small dark circle that had mistaken itself for fate. She opened the bottom drawer, took out the box with the unsent letters, and laid one across her knees. "Dear you," she had always written, because she had not known his name. Tonight she wrote her own. "Dear Eliza," the letter began. She told herself what the women she loved in books had learned too late or just in time. That love without respect is a show for strangers. That any belonging purchased with the coin of yourself is too expensive. That the house of your life is not an address someone else can rent. When she finished, she did not fold the paper. She slid it under the heavy glass jar on the mantel, so it could look at the room, and the room could look back, and both could understand. She undid her hair, washed her face, put on the cardigan Ruth had pressed against her shoulders, and went to the window. The town had turned on its warm, small stars. Lamps, kitchen lights, the brave square of the bakery where tomorrow's bread already had its instructions. She slept as people sleep after they have pulled themselves out of a story that meant to drown them. Unevenly, but truly, with long slabs of darkness stitched together by brief, bright surfaces. When morning found her, it did not ask questions. It handed her a sky and a street and the work of living. On the table lay the list she and her mother had made. Call the registrar, return the ring, tell the truth to those who deserved it, and tell silence to those who only wanted a better rumor. The day waited, ordinary and vast. She was afraid, and she was certain. She was not finished. She was beginning. And somewhere, in a city that had believed itself the center of all maps, a man sat alone in a room designed to prevent loneliness and learned, perhaps for the first time, how loud a door can sound when it closes itself without permission. Dawn came without ceremony, spreading itself across the town like a pale shawl, quiet and unassuming, as though the world itself wanted to tiptoe into Eliza's life and see whether she would still be standing. She was, barefoot in her kitchen, hair loose over her shoulders. She stood in the square of light spilling from the window and let the ordinary day wash over her. The gown was gone. The veil was gone. The weight of illusion was gone. And yet, what remained was not emptiness. It was a strange, luminous stillness, the kind that follows a storm too fierce for words. Her mother moved around her softly, as if both proud and protective. The kettle hissed its familiar promise. The scent of bread rose from the oven, that faithful language of survival. Every small sound felt enlarged, significant. The creak of the wooden chair, the soft landing of flour on the table, the clock's patient confession that another minute had lived and passed. It was in these details that Eliza rediscovered herself. The world had not ended, though the story she had thought was her world had shattered. No, life persisted, and in its persistence she found a kind of miracle. She walked to the library later that morning, her steps deliberate, her heart still bruised, but beating with a new insistence. The building welcomed her like a friend who had waited without judgment. The scent of paper met her as if to remind her, "You are still a reader, still a keeper of words, still someone whose story cannot be stolen." She shelved books with steady hands, each spine sliding into place like a piece of her spirit returning to where it belonged. Patrons greeted her, some with curiosity, some with concern, but she smiled in the way one smiles when a secret has been wrestled into truth. The whispers in the town carried on, as whispers always do. Some pitied her, some judged, some admired the courage she had shown in walking away. Eliza let the whispers be. They were not her story anymore. Her story lived in the quiet decisions she made each day. To drink tea slowly, to read poems aloud even when no one listened, to look in the mirror and recognize not only the bruises of betrayal, but also the strength that had risen to meet it. There were nights when loneliness curled at her side like an unwelcome companion. She would lie awake and remember the thrill of Adrian's gaze, the intoxicating glow of being adored, and the way desire had dressed itself as destiny. But then she would remember the darker truths. The bracelet on her wrist that felt like a chain, the voices of his friends wrapping around her like a net, the door that had locked her in. And she would whisper to herself, "Better the ache of solitude than the prison of false love." Each time she repeated it, the words grew heavier with certainty. Time became her healer, but not in the soft, dreamy way books often promised. Healing was work. It was bread baked and eaten without guilt. It was long walks by the river where she let the water carry her unsent letters away, each current a small absolution. It was laughter with her mother over something trivial, the way the cat refused to respect the flower pots, the way the baker had started to flirt with Ruth, as if to test whether years mattered. Healing was in the details, and Eliza tended to them carefully. One afternoon, while reading aloud to the children in the library, she caught herself smiling so fully that her cheeks ached. Their eyes widened at the climax of the story, their laughter filled the alcove, and Eliza realized she had become the kind of woman who could still give joy even after her own heart had been tested. That discovery was a balm, a revelation. Pain had not turned her into stone. It had, somehow, turned her into something softer, something stronger. Letters still filled her drawer, but they were no longer addressed to a faceless you. They were addressed to herself, to the girl she had been and the woman she was becoming. She wrote of courage, of choice, of the sacredness of freedom. She told herself the truth in ink so that she could never again forget it. Love is not chains disguised as roses. Love is not control dressed in charm. Love is a table where both sit as equals, where silence is safe, where the door is always open. Seasons turned. Orchids bloomed and withered in the florist's shop window, but Eliza did not stop to look at them any more. She preferred wild flowers now, messy, untamed, defiant in their beauty. They reminded her of herself. The town carried on, as towns always do, but inside her a new rhythm had taken root. She no longer rushed to meet life. She allowed life to meet her, on her terms. And though she did not yet know what the future held, she knew this: she was no longer afraid. If love came again, it would not be because she had been dazzled or persuaded. It would be because she had chosen, freely, fully, with eyes wide open. That knowledge was its own form of peace. So she stood one evening at the bridge, the iron rail cool beneath her palms, and watched the river collect the last light of day. It shimmered, restless and eternal, carrying everything forward: the lies, the promises, the tears, the laughter. She leaned into the wind and whispered to herself, "I am mine." The words dissolved into the air, but their truth remained, carved deeper than any scar. And to you, dear listener of her story, if you have walked with Eliza through her journey, if you have felt the tremor of her heartbreak and the rising strength of her voice, then let this ending be an invitation. Share your thoughts, leave a comment, let your own heart speak. If her story has touched you, if it has made you believe in the quiet, fierce beauty of freedom and love, then I invite you, like this video, subscribe for more stories that breathe, and carry them into your days. Your voice matters here, your presence matters here, and together we will keep turning the pages.